If your old man ever swore by Mopar muscle, this is the story he wished he knew. 1969. Detroit was at war. Not the kind with casualties and medals, but the kind fought in quarter-mile increments, measured in tenths of seconds, and bragging rights that lasted decades. Chevrolet had the big block 454. Ford was pushing the 429 Cobra Jet. And Chrysler? Chrysler was about to do something that would make both of them look like they weren't even trying. The 446 pack, 3 two-barrel carburetors sitting on top of 440 cubic inches of cast-iron fury. From the factory, Chrysler claimed 390 horsepower. That number was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Chrysler knew it was a lie. Insurance companies suspected it was a lie. The guys who actually drove these things, they knew exactly how much of a lie it was. But here's the thing about factory ratings. They're conservative on purpose. What nobody told you was that the real potential of that engine was buried somewhere in those 3 carburetors. And unlocking it? That required knowledge that most mechanics didn't have. Most dealers didn't have it. Most Chrysler engineers, if we're being honest, didn't fully understand what they'd created. One man did. Norm Kramer wasn't famous. Not then, anyway. He wasn't on magazine covers or doing interviews for Hot Rod. He was just a guy in a shop who happened to notice things other people missed. And what he noticed about the 446 pack would change everything. The problem with the 6-pack setup was simple to describe and incredibly difficult to solve. You had 3 Holley 2-barrel carburetors mounted on an aluminum intake manifold. The center carburetor handled idle and light cruise. The 2 outboard carburetors sat there dormant until you buried your foot in it. Then vacuum-operated linkage would crack them open, and suddenly you had 3 carburetors dumping fuel into 8 cylinders. In theory, this was elegant. In practice, it was a disaster waiting to happen. See, most guys who bought these cars treated them like any other muscle car. They'd tinker with timing, they'd swap jets, they'd mess with the accelerator pump, standard hot rodding stuff, and they'd get results. Mediocre results, sometimes worse than stock results. The engine would stumble, it would hesitate, it would run rich at idle and lean under full throttle. It would foul plugs. It would backfire through the carburetors. Dealer mechanics would shrug. Factory service bulletins offered suggestions that didn't really help. Owners would sell the cars in frustration, convinced they'd bought a lemon. They hadn't. They just didn't know what Norm Kramer knew. So here's the deal. The 446 pack wasn't designed like other engines. It was designed by committee, which meant different engineering teams handled different components, and nobody fully coordinated with anybody else. The carburetor team optimized their carburetors. The intake team designed their intake. The camshaft guys spec'd their camshaft. When you bolted it all together, you got something that worked, barely, under ideal conditions, which never actually existed in the real world. Kramer's insight started with a question nobody else thought to ask. What if the carburetors weren't the problem? What if the problem was what happened between the carburetors? The standard tuning approach treated each carburetor as an independent unit. Tune the center carb for idle. Tune the outboards for full throttle. Simple, right? Wrong. The 3 carburetors didn't operate independently. They shared an intake manifold. They shared a plenum. The air and fuel from one carburetor didn't just go straight down into a cylinder. It mixed. It interacted. It created pressure waves and reversion pulses that affected the other carburetors. What came out of one carburetor influenced what went into another. Nobody was accounting for this. Kramer spent months with vacuum gauges and air-fuel meters and a lot of patience. He'd make one tiny change, run the engine, record everything, then make another tiny change. Where other tuners were making 3 or 4 adjustments at a time, Kramer was making 1, then waiting, then measuring, then thinking. What he discovered was that the center carburetor was calibrated too rich at idle. Not by much, maybe 8%. But that 8% threw off everything else. Here's why. When the center carb ran slightly rich, it created a subtle but consistent overfueling condition at low speeds. The engine compensated by running slightly retarded timing to prevent detonation. This worked fine until you hit the throttle hard, and the outboard carbs opened. Now you had two additional carburetors dumping fuel into a system that was already running rich. The engine couldn't burn it all. Unburned fuel would wash past the rings into the oil. Spark plugs would foul. And worst of all, the momentary over-rich condition would cause the engine to stumble just as you needed maximum acceleration. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Kramer's solution was counterintuitive. Instead of richening the outboard carbs to match the center carb, he leaned out the center carb to work with the outboards. He went 2 jet sizes leaner on the center carburetor, just 2 sizes. The difference was maybe 15% less fuel at idle. The results were immediate and dramatic. The idle smoothed out. The transition stumble disappeared. The engine suddenly hit like it was supposed to. All that power that had been hiding behind bad calibration? It showed up, all of it. But Kramer wasn't done. The accelerator pump timing on the 6-pack was another factory compromise. The standard setup squirted fuel into the carburetors the moment you touched the throttle. This was fine for normal driving. For racing? For hard acceleration from a dig? It was wrong. The pump shot came too early. By the time the engine actually needed that extra fuel, the pump shot had already been consumed. You got a momentary surge, then a flat spot. Then power came in late. Experienced drivers learned to compensate unconsciously. They'd roll into the throttle, wait for the power to catch up, then floor it. They didn't know they were doing this. They just knew something felt off. Kramer changed the accelerator pump cam to delay the shot by about 200 milliseconds, less than a quarter second. The difference was transformative. Now, the fuel arrived exactly when the engine needed it. That flat spot vanished. Power delivery became linear and immediate. Word started to spread, quietly at first. A guy would bring his 6-pack car to Kramer's shop complaining about hesitation. Kramer would spend an afternoon with it. The guy would leave with a car that felt like it had 50 more horsepower. It didn't have 50 more horsepower. Not really. But it felt like it did because the power was actually usable now. The engine did what the driver expected when the driver expected it. Then the racing guys got involved. In 1970, a few NHRA stock eliminator competitors were struggling with their 6-pack cars. These were guys who knew what they were doing. They had the rules memorized. They had the car prep dialed. But they kept losing to cars that should have been slower on paper. One of them heard about Kramer. He brought his car to the shop expecting some exotic modification, some secret trick that bent the rules. Instead, Kramer handed him a small plastic bag with 4 jets and a different accelerator pump cam. That was it, jets and a cam. Total parts cost was maybe $12. The guy went back to the track. He reset his personal best by 0.3 of a second. In stock eliminator racing, where hundredths of seconds separate winners from losers, 0.3 was an eternity. Now, 0.3 doesn't sound like much if you don't know drag racing. So let me put it in perspective. In a 10-second quarter-mile pass, 0.3 of a second translates to roughly 4 car lengths at the finish line. That's the difference between winning and watching someone else collect the trophy. Other racers noticed. They asked questions. The guy didn't want to give up his advantage, but eventually word got out anyway. It always does. By 1971, there was an unofficial network of 6-pack owners who knew about Kramer's calibration specs. They'd share them at car shows and in parking lots and through letters mailed between strangers who'd never met. A guy in Ohio would send a letter to a guy in California describing exactly which jets to use and how to set the accelerator pump. No money changed hands, just information. Chrysler never officially acknowledged any of this. The factory spec remained the factory spec. But a few Chrysler engineers, the ones who actually cared about making the cars faster, quietly obtained Kramer's specifications and studied them. They couldn't implement the changes in production. The emissions implications alone would have been a nightmare, but they understood, finally. The technical explanation for why Kramer's tune worked goes deeper than just jetting. The 446 pack used a cast aluminum intake manifold with a two-plane design. Each cylinder bank had its own plenum, and the plenums were divided by a wall down the center. This was supposed to improve low-speed torque by keeping the intake pulses separated. But at high RPM, the divider wall became a problem. It created turbulence, it restricted airflow, and most importantly, it changed how the carburetors interacted with each other. At idle and low speed, the center carburetor fed both plenums through small crossover passages. The outboard carbs fed their respective plenums directly. This asymmetry meant the fuel distribution was never truly even. The center two cylinders on each bank got a slightly different mixture than the end cylinders. Kramer figured this out through a technique that was, frankly, tedious. He pulled the spark plugs after every test run and read them. Not just a quick glance for color. He used a magnifying glass. He looked at the electrode gap. He looked at the porcelain insulator. He compared plug to plug, cylinder to cylinder, run to run. What he found was that cylinders 2 and 7 ran consistently richer than the others. Not by a lot. Maybe half an air-fuel ratio point, but enough to matter. His solution involved changing the primary fuel distribution in the center carburetor. He modified the fuel bowl venting to create slightly lower float levels under acceleration. This reduced the fuel available to the center carburetor at the exact moment when the outboards were coming online. Now all 8 cylinders were seeing approximately the same mixture at the same time. The engine didn't have 2 cylinders dragging down the others. This required drilling a small vent hole in the center carburetor's float bowl. 8/64ths of an inch. That's 1/8 of an inch. Kramer discovered through trial and error that this specific size created just enough pressure differential to lean out the center carb at high flow without affecting idle quality. Was this technically illegal for stock class racing? Probably. But the modification was internal, invisible, and virtually undetectable during tech inspection. More importantly, it replicated what the carburetor should have done from the factory if the engineering had been better coordinated. The camshaft timing was Kramer's other obsession. The factory 446 pack cam was a hydraulic flat tappet design with 276 degrees of advertised duration on both intake and exhaust. The lobe separation angle was 110 degrees, which was fairly conservative for a performance application. Most hot rodders, when they wanted more power, would swap in an aftermarket cam with more duration and more lift. This was the standard playbook for any muscle car. Kramer went the other direction. He discovered that the 6-pack's intake manifold and carburetor combination worked best with less overlap, not more. The standard cam's 110-degree lobe separation created too much valve overlap for the specific airflow characteristics of the 3-carburetor setup. Reversion pulses from the exhaust were contaminating the intake charge. His recommendation was to degree the stock cam 2 degrees advanced, just 2 degrees. This slightly increased low-end torque while reducing the overlap timing that was causing the reversion problems. It also improved throttle response because the intake valve opened earlier in the cycle, giving the intake charge more time to fill the cylinder. 2 degrees. On a 440 cubic inch engine spinning at 5,000 RPM, 2 degrees of cam timing represents about 67 millionths of a second. The difference between the intake valve opening at exactly the right moment versus slightly late. Kramer could feel this difference in how the car accelerated. His right foot was his most accurate instrument. The distributor curve was the final piece. Factory ignition timing on the 6-pack was set at 2.5 degrees before top dead center at idle, advancing to a maximum of 32.5 degrees by about 3,000 RPM. This was conservative, designed to run on the low-octane fuel that many owners would use. Kramer found that the engine wanted more initial timing and less total advance. He set initial timing at 12 degrees and limited total advance to 28 degrees. This gave faster throttle response off idle while preventing detonation at high RPM. The mechanical advance curve was also too slow from the factory. The weights and springs in the distributor were calibrated for smooth daily driving, not maximum acceleration. Kramer swapped the springs to bring full advance in by 2,200 RPM instead of 3,000. Now the engine had maximum timing available right when the driver needed it, during hard acceleration through the low gears. Combined with the carburetor modifications and the cam timing adjustment, the ignition changes transformed the six-pack from an engine that was fast on paper to an engine that was actually fast in the real world. The consequences of Kramer's work extended far beyond a few faster drag racing times. His techniques became the foundation for six-pack tuning knowledge that persists to this day. If you buy a 446-pack car now, in 2024, and you join an online forum or a Mopar club, the tuning advice you'll receive will be directly descended from what Kramer figured out 55 years ago. The specific jet sizes, the accelerator pump modification, the distributor curve. It's all there, passed down through generations of enthusiasts. More importantly, Kramer's approach demonstrated something fundamental about engineering that often gets overlooked. The factory isn't always right. The engineers who designed a system don't always understand how it works in practice. And sometimes the solution to a problem isn't adding more parts or making bigger changes. Sometimes it's a small adjustment in the right place. Chrysler eventually moved on from the six-pack. By 1971, emissions regulations were tightening. The insurance companies had figured out what those three carburetors meant. The muscle car era was ending, but for that brief window, 1969 to 71, the properly tuned 446-pack was essentially unbeatable in its class. The guys who knew how to make it work dominated stock eliminator racing. The guys who didn't wondered why their expensive engine couldn't beat a small block Chevy. The difference was knowledge that one man figured out through patience and observation, and a willingness to question what everyone else assumed was true. Norm Kramer didn't become famous for this. There are no statues of him, no documentaries. Most people who drive six-pack cars today have never heard his name. They just know the tuning specs without knowing where they came from. That's how it goes sometimes. The important work gets done by people who care more about solving the problem than getting credit for solving it. They leave behind knowledge instead of fame, and that knowledge keeps working long after they're gone. Today, a properly restored 446-pack car will sell for $200,000 or more at auction. The buyers know they're getting something special. They might not know exactly why the carburetors are jetted the way they are or why the timing is set where it is. They just know it works. It works because one guy in a shop spent months figuring out what the factory got wrong, and then he told everyone who would listen. So that's the story of the 446-pack, an engine that was better than anyone realized, hidden behind calibration that was worse than it should have been, and one man who understood that the difference between a legend and a disappointment sometimes comes down to a few jet sizes and a timing adjustment. 55 years later, the carburetors still matter. The details still matter. The difference between good and great is still measured in fractions too small to see. If you've ever wrenched on one of these or you've got a six-pack story I missed, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week.